board chair at a client once told me that her organization had a 5-year strategic plan, a 3-year operating plan, and a 1-year budget. So I asked her how far back the organization's memory actually went. She paused, and then she admitted it went back, well, about 18 months, which was roughly the tenure of her average senior leaders. We plan in years. We remember in months. And then, well, we wonder why transformation never seems to take hold. Most of what we call organizational change happens on a clock measured in quarters. A new leader arrives, launches a new initiative, claims a win, and moves on before anyone can tell whether the change actually held. But every so often, you meet someone who has stayed long enough to see the entire arc. Someone who was in the room when a decision was made, there again when it failed, and there a decade later when it finally worked. That perspective is rare, and it's exactly what today's episode is going to be all about. I'm Kevin Novak, CEO of 2040 Digital, professor at the University of Maryland, and author of the book, The Truth About Transformation, Leading in the Age of AI, Uncertainty, and Human Complexity, along with the Ideas and Innovations weekly newsletter. Welcome to the Human Factor Podcast, the show that explores the intersection of humanity, technology, and transformation, along with the psychology behind transformation success. Today's episode is called The Long Game, Leading Institutional Transformation Across Decades. To explore that question, I'm joined by someone with a vantage point almost no one in this field has. Tom Serena is the Chief Executive Officer of the American Gastroenterological Association, which is one of the most prominent medical associations in the country, if not the globe. Tom has been with AGA since 1994, and he has served as its CEO since 2010. Across that tenure, he has led the organization well beyond its traditional mission, into health equity through the Equity Project, into venture investment through the GI Opportunity Fund, into workforce development, and through multiple governance transformations. Very few leaders have guided a single institution through 3 decades of change. Well, fewer still have done it while expanding what that institution believes it is even allowed to do. Tom, welcome to the Human Factor Podcast. I'm grateful that you made the time today.
Kevin, I'm honored to be invited. Thank you. That's laudatory introduction is not deserved.
Yeah, it is very much deserved. So, Tom, here's how I'd like to spend our time together. I'll bring a piece of research to each part of the conversation, and it's the format of the podcast. And it's looking at the way scholars have tried to explain why organizations change or they simply fail to. And then I'll turn it over to you because you've lived the reality that the research only describes from the outside. So I'll jump into the first segment. So let me start with a puzzle that organizational scholars have wrestled with for decades. In 1983, 2 sociologists, Paul DiMaggio and Walter Powell, which I talk about often in the newsletter as well as the podcast, they published a paper asking why organizations in the same field tend to look more and more alike over time. They called it institutional isomorphism, and they identified 3 forces that drive it. So coercive pressure, which is from regulation and funders; mimetic pressure, where under uncertainty conditions, organizations simply copy whatever appears to be succeeding; and normative pressures from the professions, the conferences, and the credentials that quietly define what a serious organization is supposed to look like. So the result is convergence, and medical associations, like organizations in almost every field, they tend to drift towards the same committee structures, the same programs, and the same language, and the same priorities. So my question, because I'm always asking long-winded questions, is about resistance to that gravity. So across your tenure, how has AGA navigated the pressure to conform to what every other association is doing? And where have you deliberately chosen a path that made AGA distinct, which you have, even when following the field would have been the safer and easier call?
Yeah, I think there's an advantage to have been with the organization this long. The longer I'm here, the more I understand where the pitfalls, the risks, and the leaders who are willing to take a chance are. That's hard to do coming into an organization. You're trying to just keep your hand on the tiller and keep it
Yeah.
going, stay on course. So some of this is just forced on us, right? We have society is democratized in so many ways. We're doing this podcast, which we would have been in a very expensive studio in the past, or
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
and that's no different with AGA. When I started, expertise and seniority rule. You would join the organization that your training director told you to, without questions. And that is now completely different. We have groups of members who are forming their own informal groups in Facebook because they want what they want rather than what AGA is offering. And frankly, you can see that in membership numbers. It's tougher to keep somebody
Yeah.
because now it's easy for them to form their own organization, everything from a Facebook group to their own 501(c)(3).
Yeah.
And we have to figure out what they want to keep them with an affinity for AGA. So some of that's been forced on us. Some of it's forced on us because of business models. The classic membership dues, publications, and education are all under stress. Frankly, it's medical education companies are nimble. They can move faster. We have all those things that you listed that we have to answer to. There's organizational ego involved in all of this. And you did a much more articulate way of describing the research, but that's all very real. But no money, no mission. And you need to pivot. Like I've learned from all these startups in our venture capital fund, it's taught me a lot. These guys don't wait around a long time before they make a change because they move to where the market's going. Before I felt like the organizations, the medical associations could make the market. That's no longer true.
So how, because we talk a lot about the human factor on the show, and because of that tenure and the need to adapt, how do you facilitate? All right, no, let me ask a question this way: with having to lead that staff through all that change and that pivoting is not easy because people get used to what they're doing, and then the responsibilities change. So, what has led to your success in that regard?
Depending on what sometimes a lot of times you need board buy-in, physician buy-in, before you can ask the staff to switch business models. Uh, some people want to change. They embrace change. They want to innovate, and some people want to hunker down, even if it's in an area that's in decline. There's always something you can do, but there's a part where you say it's not going to go anywhere. To be honest, I don't think you can convince everybody to change. You find the people who are willing and anxious to do something new, and we have a lot at AGA. That's been huge for us. And then people will go along when they see there's a vortex, there's some
Yeah.
leadership, and people will follow that.
That's really cool. So Eric Hopland, who is the CEO of NAW, National Association of Wholesaler Distributors, was on a few weeks ago, and he talked about that in thirds. When he comes into an organization, he's really looking for the three thirds where there are those adopters, those people that want change, those people in the middle who are sort of ready for change, but are going to be the followers. And then the other third who is not ready for any change, but needs to be curated along by the other two thirds.
That's a great way to frame it. And I can't imagine what it's like doing culture change. It's something we have 100 employees. I, I don't know how you change something in a large organization like that. That's a different level for me.
Yeah, yes, it's a multiplication factor that's sometimes challenging. So that distinctiveness, it leads me to another tension because choosing your own path is one thing. Sustaining it while also keeping the core running is another problem entirely. I mean, you have an entire audience that has expectations of AGA and a variety of different demographics, all with their own needs sets, even based on the work that we have done with AGA. So there's a body of research from Charles O'Reilly at Stanford and Michael Tushman at Harvard on what they call organizational ambidexterity. And it's the core finding that enduring organizations have to do two contradictory things at once. They have to exploit, which means running and refining what they're already good at. And they have to explore, which means building capabilities that don't yet exist and may not pay off for years. The hard part is that these two compete, obviously. They compete for budget, for attention, for talent, and for the leader's own time. And exploitation almost always wins in the short run, at least based on the research, because it's measurable and it feels safe. So AGA has had to do both. You sustain the core, the clinical guidelines, the education, the research, advocacy, the work the members count on every single year. And at the same time, you've stood up entirely new institutional capabilities. So how do you actually hold that tension, right? When the core is what funds you and the new work is the very thing that unsettles the comfort of the core. How do you protect the explore side from being quietly starved by the exploit side?
Wow, that's profound. That's good. I think to your thirds, there are the group who are going to keep the current programs running. But I mean, as I think about the two biggest things that I would point to that we've changed are the innovation and the venture capital fund, and then our governance. And I had a heavy hand in both of those. So I was the guy with the extra time and, the desire. Leadership is a big part of that. The leader can do that. And as far as the actual operationalizing that, again, I had people who were anxious to try something new. And I hadn't thought about the tension, but that probably caused a lot of problems that I was aware, or invisible friction that kept me from going faster. And one of the things, Kevin, is you asked posed the questions for me ahead of the show. So the denominator in change for me is pace and patience. And I've just learned that you generally don't control the pace other than in an emergency. And if you do, you're going to be frustrated because you really have to build a foundation before the change you want is visible to everybody. I don't know if I'm going off track,
No,
but
no, no. That's exactly where I want to be going with you on that because, Tom, the tenure alone begets that you have had to be incredibly patient. And in contrast, when you look across the average tenure in organizations, so not just associations, I mean, this is government or companies and so forth. And so looking at it from a chief marketing officer, right, that average tenure went from 18 months now to 12 months. And I guess last week, right, we were just exploring that to say, what is the issue? Is it adaptability? Is it the lack of expertise in how fast things are moving? Or is it simply that the organization doesn't have patience to let something actually mature? Or does that person or that team not actually have patience? So how, with the tension to sort of keep the wheels on the bus while building a newer bus, and I'll preface this by my own experience with AGA. So in the early career professionals research study, and sitting in a room at the Hyatt or whatever it was downtown, and asking them a variety of different questions. And they're young people saying AGA should stop talking to us. To your earlier point on these general platforms, we use niche communications. We don't want the email. We want it in this way. And that's a friction. It creates tension because the bus, well, to hold the wheels on the bus, right? You are continuing to do that. So how do you manage your own patience in that regards?
well, but I've been burned enough times. Honestly, one of the difficult things it's a two-edged sword, the turnover on the governing board.
Yeah.
Most of them serve 2-3 year terms. The officers serve 4 year terms. And back in the day when I was starting, there were a new set of priorities every year because the president had a lot of prerogative. And having sat back, I wasn't the CEO for 15 years. I got to watch it. It was very frustrating.
Hmm.
And it didn't matter because, as I pointed out earlier, it's seniority, expertise. That's the thing that rules. And it was it was fine when all you were doing, your annual meeting and your publication, everything, all cylinders were hitting and the funding was coming in and you could have pet projects. It was just frustrating. But then it became an inhibitor, right? I mean, all those old business lines were starting to flatline and we need to do significant new, initiatives, and we had to end the pet projects. And I will say that I can point to two former presidents who allowed us to change governance, to bring the governing board from basically a super committee to an executive body that worried about strategy and the purpose of the organization. And there was continuity from one board to the next. It didn't change every year. Even we've completely turned the board over several times since we initiated this governance transformation, but it's stuck. They know that we need to focus on several things to keep maintain viability. So I think my bottom line is that if your leadership isn't aligned and focused, you're going to be fighting to bring any kind of change because everybody has their own idea of what change should be.
Well, always, right? And this is based on experience, and just I'll put this in the association context because there are so many organizations in the association realm that try to alter the governance. And across the year, 42 organizations that I've worked with so far over these years. And some have boards of 50, 60, 70 people. And the tension is the recognition that decision making needs to be, to your point, an executive body or a smaller group of people, that it is actually very difficult to get those 70 people focused, right, and manage that process. So, what was the successful factors that allowed you to make those changes in the governance?
Well, we did get the board down to 13. I think that's a good number. We had, as I said, two presidents who allowed us to try some new things. Before a board meeting be somewhat satisfactory because you'd come in with a list of decisions, you'd make
Yeah,
them, it was very black and white. But to be honest, it wasn't worthy of the brain power in the room. I mean, these are physicians, these are people who run hospitals, and we were asking them for very mundane decisions. But that's satisfying, right? Because there's a beginning and an end. The questions we turned to were more existential. I don't want to overstate it, but where are we going? Membership is flatlining, and publications, we have a lot of competition.
yeah,
And once they got into a sort of a mode of learning more about what's the industry and what's happening and getting time to think, they appreciated that because a lot of our physicians are curious people and they like that work. So I think giving me the opportunity to introduce a new way for the board to work and sort of show them that, yeah, this is a better way to do it. So that buy-in was huge. And if I had resistance, I'm not sure we'd be where we are today.
that's awesome because it's not atypical. There always seems to be resistance coming from multiple groups. I mean, resistance is a very human thing. So,
Well, some of these people are successful in the old system, and it's hard to tell them, like, we didn't change that. I said, but that system brought me here. It's almost, you want to
yeah,
avoid insulting them, but that doesn't work today because, Kevin, as you pointed out, you speak to early career GIs. It doesn't work that way for them. And if you don't bring that new blood into the system, your system is going to be ossified.
yeah,
And I think our board did recognize that.
yeah. So it was interesting, Tom. So I gave a presentation at what is membership marketing, communication, and now technology conference for ASAE a few weeks ago, and it was about using psychological demographics. And one of the points I made, and there's a variety of research out there and in the association space where the questions have been to staff, do you believe in your value proposition? And I used that research to say that, well, if only 17% of association staff in the association industry believes that an association's value proposition is compelling, what do you think the audience is feeling about that? And so, to your point, there's a lag, I think, with many organizations where you have been forward thinking and very much pivoting and opportunistic to say, yes, membership is declining. There are other things that we need to be doing to adapt to the audience and what they're believing that we should bring to the table. Because you've built several things that simply didn't exist before. Let's start with one of the most significant, which was the equity project. And so, one thing the research consistently underestimates is timing. The same initiative can fail in one year, and you kind of hit on this earlier, and succeed in another. And the only thing that changed was readiness. The organization had quietly built the relationships, the credibility, the internal language, and the trust that the work needed in order to survive contact with reality. So I think of it as invisible groundwork, and the work that never shows up in an announcement, but determines whether the announcement means anything at all. So the Equity Project represents a real institutional commitment to health equity and gastro. But my question isn't really about the initiative itself, right? It's about what came before it. So, what made AGA ready for that work at the moment that it launched? And what groundwork did you have to lay to have in place? And again, maybe years in advance or years in circumspect, right? For it to take hold rather than become one more well intentioned program that quietly fades.
I think that I would characterize gastroenterology in our association a diverse constituency. It existed at that time. Equity was at the forefront, and the organization realized it needed to do something more deliberate. And I'll give credit to we a great staff person, but also our current president, Byron Cryer, was the leader, one of the leaders of that project. Uh, so you had a committed leader. And I think the other thing, well, I know the other thing that they did was just provide clarity about what we were doing. It wasn't, to your point, about creating a language.
Mhm.
They developed this tool that discussed several domains of equity and what we were trying to achieve, but they also identified a future state in this grid, and then the steps to get there. And I think instead of being glib and using sort of standardized language, they were very specific about what we were trying to achieve and how we're going to get there. And between that and when people know where we're going, they took the ball and ran with it. And it's been inculcated in the culture here. And that's where it started, just clarity and good leadership.
So let me ask about the GI Opportunity Fund, because nothing tests the institution's sense of what it's allowed to do quite like something like that. And what you've done is in that regard is very atypical. I know a few examples in the association community where they really have embraced that. And one of those was American Thoracic Society, where they recognized as part of their annual meeting that they needed to bring the banks and the small companies and so forth together. And now that's been 10 years. And I'm feeling old just even saying that because I helped do that back then. But it's been 10 years, and that event, that portion of the event has actually grown significantly. So there's a concept in institutional theory called institutional entrepreneurship. And it describes leaders who don't simply operate within the boundaries of what their institutions are allowed to do, but who actually moves those boundaries, who expand the definition of what counts as legitimate activity for an organization like this, right? It's genuinely risky because the moment you step outside that expected boundary, and with AGA's demographics, you do have those components that are looking at you to be what you are and what you always have been. So it's not what an organization like yours is supposed to do in perception by some in the audience. So a medical association entering venture investment is that kind of move. And the GI Opportunity Fund sits well outside the traditional boundaries of what it means to be a medical association. So, curious about two things here. What was the institutional logic that made the move make sense from the inside? And then, how did you build that legitimacy for it? How did you bring a board and a membership along to something that, on its face, sat outside the lines of what they thought they had signed up for or what they expected?
So there are two parallel things going on. About 15 years ago, we formed a Center for GI Innovation and Technology, and it really was a recognition that startups were inhibited in GI for multiple reasons: funding, regulatory, clinical diligence. And so we would give advice to startups, and then we sort of say good luck. And that was it. Part one. Part two was I read a headline in 2014. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation received sold their royalties to a drug they invested in for 3.3 billion. And I said, we need to sign up for that.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, A, financially, that just got your attention. And B, it would complement our work in innovation. So this is a story of failure and failure and failure. So when I introduced the concept to the board, I thought I had everything lined up. I thought I had a compelling story, potential for remuneration. Also, it was mission oriented, and I had a great champion, former board chairman, who was well respected. And that idea went down in flames because we brought in a venture capitalist who was going to explain how it worked. This person spoke too fast, spoke with
Yeah,
jargon, almost spoke down to the board.
yeah,
And the board, it was like, no, it gave them a discomfort, an uncertainty of the risk. And like, we're fine today. We don't need to take on this risk. And, it took a while. I had to wait for a little turnover and try to understand. And I viewed that as resistance. Like, you guys, you need
yeah,
to take on risk.
yeah,
And it was less that than it was not not allowing the pace to take place at the rate that they could absorb. And a few years later, things lined up again, and I have a great champion. Mike Coachman is our current treasurer, so I had somebody on the board who was well respected, and we slowed it down. We did a lot more foundational work, explaining how it worked,
mhm,
explaining, framing the risk, and framing the fact that AGA could establish an identity. To your point, Kevin, and we want to distinguish ourselves. We don't want to just keep doing like I find these startups the source of more ideas than I do sort of the
yeah,
association world, because we want to break out of that
yeah,
because it's not working anymore.
right, yeah,
So the stars aligning and letting the process follow its natural pace ended up the board let us establish the fund, and the most impressive thing to me was that that fund is funded by members, most of whom I don't know. They're new to me, and I've been around a long time. So that was really encouraging. There's a thirst to be attached and associated with innovation. I'm sure it would be great if everybody made some money on this, but the most important thing is we're catalyzing innovation.
mhm.
So again, failed to recognize how the system could absorb a new idea like that.
So with that foundation, Tom, and I talk a lot about this with the human factor element of resistance, and there's a variety of different flavors of it, and it's not intended resistance. It's to your point. I think you gave that great real example of the consultant or the equity person came in and talked way too fast, making assumptions that everybody understood. They were obviously lost and right away became self defensive. And I think that I see that so very often where an organization is trying to move fast and forgets the necessity to inform those people to build that foundation, but to ensure that they're going to come along. And to your point on you have great staff who are ready to pick up that ball and want to see things like this happen. I mean, that's so critically important. So, um, these are my passion areas. So sometimes I can ramble myself.
As I prepare for this, what I learned, and it ends up there's a lot of complex research, and it does devolve with like these human being lessons and what people are capable of, what they want to do, and pace and all those other things.
Yeah. So when you're recognizing the right time, like you said, there's several failures, and then it was the right time to bring it back. How did you prepare yourself for those people to re-educate them and reinitiate that and then lead through it?
It was educating them so that they were comfortable making a decision. And frankly, that's what we do with the board now. The board has to wrestle with a lot of things they haven't seen before. AI. Some of them know more than others, but we don't want one expert on the board swaying a decision. So we
Yeah.
spend a lot of time bringing speakers in to get everybody to a common understanding. So everybody's making a decision with some knowledge and some confidence that they know something about it. Scholarly publishing, most of the academics know about scholarly publishing. Not everybody in private practice know the operations of,
Yeah.
the finances and peer review, those kind of things. So, but I think we don't want, they might not even know the questions to ask. So we do a lot, we spend time trying to help people get up to, sort of learning sessions during our board meetings.
So I want to explore in that regard the foundation, and to your point, bringing people up to speed to create the understanding as well as the synergies for decision making, which is always so critical. So institutional theory has a lot to say about structure and ensuring something like that happens. And one of its more uncomfortable insights is that formal structures that we build tend to enable actions that eventually constrain it. And I really want your perspective on this because you've been in this role and you've led this government transformation. So, governance is the clearest example. The committees, the bylaws, the approval pathways, the composition of the board itself. And so, all of it exists to create legitimacy and accountability. And it can be quietly, it can quietly become the reasons that nothing is able to change because that structure becomes so rigid. So, researchers often find that governance reform is a prerequisite for deeper transformation, that you can't change what an organization does until you change how it actually decides. So, you've navigated multiple governance transformations at AGA. What has that taught you about the relationship between governance and the institution's capacity to transform? And to be more specific, where have you seen governance genuinely enable change? And where have you watched it constrain change, even with the best possible people sitting around the table?
I believe that the line we've learned is prepare for loss of control. And the board, in a positive way, is try not to do the committees and staff work. Be confident that you have established a direction and a vision that they can proceed with enough clarity that they can execute or even develop their own strategy.
Mhm.
Part B, where it doesn't work, like you can establish all the bureaucracy you want, but one maverick can topple it and really divert the organization. The person might not succeed. They might succeed for a while, but it's so disruptive. We'll bring them back into conformity, but it's so disruptive and spend so much time and energy. So I guess my point is an individual can upset that depending on what the organization will let an individual do. I think that ours is at this point has done a good job of balancing planning for loss of control. You don't need to make every decision. Others are charged with that and being comfortable with that.
You said earlier, related to the newer things that AGA is doing, is there's a necessity there because the older model isn't working anymore, or components of it are. And so that alone creates a situational anxiousness. And that's both on the board side. I mean, the practitioners themselves, those fields are changing so rapidly based on technology. And then you have a staff who also are experiencing that. Does that then feed into maybe popping a wheel off the bus because there is that anxiousness and it becomes a inhibitor in many ways, or something that has to take your time to, in essence, facilitate that, reduce that anxiousness?
A plan change is one thing, and unplanned is another. It's the unplanned when somebody comes in with an idea and wants to jump the line, so to speak.
Yeah.
It's disruptive. And I know, I try to guard against being overly bureaucratic and having a lot of layers. I think we move things through pretty quickly. It's when you try to jump the line, you might succeed once or twice, but it's so disruptive to the system. Those unplanned ones are difficult to manage. I think the planned ones, like I said, I mean, we've been able to introduce some new things with the people we have, the board and the staff we have. And again, I think it's a matter of like some people are just motivated
Mm.
to try new things. And like, I think we're very fortunate that
Yeah, you have good people. So, um, shifting to from the institution to you, because you're incredibly intuitive, incredibly smart. And because 3 decades doesn't only change an organization, it changes the person that has led it. So Ronald Heifetz at Harvard drew a distinction that I come back to constantly in my writing and research. So he separated technical problems from adaptive challenges. And you hit on this a bit earlier. A technical problem has a known solution and an expert who can apply it. So the plan, the known plan, you can project manage your way through it. An adaptive challenge is very different. So the problem is tangled up in people's values, their habits, and their identities. And there's no expert with the answer. The solution has to be learned, often by the very people who would rather not change. So the argument is that most common failure in leadership is treating an adaptive challenge as if it was a technical one. So having led AGA through multiple strategic cycles since 1994, what did you believe about leading change early in your tenure that you have since revised or even abandoned outright? And so putting this another way, what does the version of you leading today understand that the version of you in the 1990s simply did not?
So I want to give credit to my coach, Bridget Tyre. I badly needed somebody and guidance when I took this job, and I learned a lot from her and a lot from experience. And the first one I'd say is just self awareness. Early on, I underestimated the gap between what you think you're communicating and how people are receiving it. And being the CEO doesn't mean you say it and they get what you're saying. And there's the need to say things over and over again. And I kept using the word clarity during this podcast because that is one of the most important things I've learned. The second thing I'd say is managing your internal state. Um, Bridget calls it being a step down transformer because your feelings radiate and affect the system, as does anybody. If you're walking into something and somebody has a frown on their face, it affects you. And I try to not negatively affect people. Sometimes I kind of have a stern face, so maybe I can't always succeed, but that's important. And the third thing is, I mentioned this before, just patience with change. Again, you think you're the CEO and you can get something done. You can't. You have to manage that through a process that the system can absorb, the pace that's comfortable for them. So sort of clarity, self-awareness about how people are receiving you, keeping the system calm so they can process things and then bring it to a pace that they can absorb.
Appreciate that you gave credit to their coach. I'm still working through my own issues, right, over the years. But my when I was deciding what to do years ago at this point, my coach Peggy Cooper basically said, because I said something, and she goes, "You can't be 1 foot here and 1 foot there." And she goes, "Everybody will pick that up. You won't appear to be committed. And so if you're looking to start a business, you need to be 2 feet into this and move forward." And I think often that external perception is really helpful to people if they're open, like you just talked through, open to that criticism to adapt. And there's a lot of writing that I've done, and I'll insert communication theory, and I have this even coming in next week's issue, and it's connected to the topic, but it's just as a constant reminder, because what we do say, we often don't take the moment to understand how it's being received. And so to your point on the clarity, you need that clarity, and it's the watching the body movements and so forth to see if people actually have understood, or at least understood enough to ask the questions that they may have to gain that further clarity. And there's a lot of leaders that just don't do that.
Yeah, that's a good way to frame it.
So, Tom, Carl Week, an organizational psychologist, spent his career studying how organizations make sense of what happens to them. One of his more provocative ideas is that strategy is often clearer in hindsight than it ever was in the moment. That we act and then we make sense of what we did. And then we tell a coherent story about it afterwards. And it has, as if it's actually been the plan all along. He argued that a great deal of organizational change is really improvisation that only later gets narrated as strategy. So when you think about the moments that most fundamentally shaped AGA's trajectory, how many were deliberate strategic decisions and how many were responses to something that you simply didn't see coming? And when it was the latter, what allowed the organization to turn an unexpected disruption into a real turning point rather than just a crisis that it managed through or survived?
Think by and large, and I came in after, we had a well-established membership, publications and education. But there are two things that were developed early on after I got here. One was the gastroenterology teaching project, and a president noticed that the fellowship programs needed to measure themselves against other. They needed to calibrate how they were doing. And he advocated, and we eventually established this national testing platform. And it goes back to the late 90s, and it is a monopoly. Every training program in the country uses it. And I was like, wow, how prescient that was. But he was in it and he noticed the gap. The other thing was our self-assessment program. I don't think that's original. A lot of organizations have self-assessment. We started ours early, and that was very intentional, trying to
Mhm.
meet people, prepare them for boards. COVID definitely was that crisis moment you were referring to, where we had to develop a process to develop guidelines quickly, and I think that was to our benefit. I, even the venture capital fund was in response to us trying to do more than say, "Hey, good luck to a startup." We want to be able to offer them, financial support and then ongoing support when they went to the market. So by and large, they've been pretty deliberate.
Good, good.
I like what if you have a lucky idea though, I'm willing to try it.
Well, I think the stability, right, and the expectability has been because of your leadership all these years, and just looking at different client organizations that are continuously riding a roller coaster, externally and internally, unfortunately, and that alone just creates so much friction and tension and inhibits where they need to go in a very dynamic world. So this brings me now to where I'd like to end to respect your time. Want to close with a question that I most wanted to ask you. So imagine a newly appointed CEO of a major medical association, someone with real ambition to lead genuine transformation, and not just the theater of it, but the real thing. And they have the energy. What they don't have yet is the one thing that you can hand someone in a briefing, which is time, which is in essence a teacher. What would you tell them about the patience that is actually required and about the mistakes that they're going to make, all of which are mistakes that might truly matter? And maybe most of all, about the invisible work, the years of groundwork that nobody sees and nobody applauds, that transformation across decades actually demands.
This is funny you asked this question because just prior to our recording this, I met a group of other CEOs, a small group that four of us meet and just sort of exchange stories. And we were talking about that this morning because there's a lot of turnover in the association world right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
But these people are all very long tenured CEOs, and we were talking about the first 90 days and that there's a tacit handbook. And one of my colleagues said, I came in like a hailstorm. Think of my career not to, I mean, some people are supposed to do a listening tour. I get that. And I would err on the side of don't come in to transform. You find out what needs to be transformed. I mean, it took me a long time to realize our governance was the way we're set up was hindering us, but that didn't come because I studied the board. I mean, I had to be immersed in it
Mhm,
for a while.
mhm.
Who are the players? Who's willing to come along? Who wants to make change? Where does the change need to take place? Learn that first.
So Tom, then how do you, because to the point on the 90 days, there's a situation that I'm aware of where a young CEO has come in and majorly affecting transformation in multiple ways, but in very unconnected ways to where the staff is not even clear on where they're going and what they should focus on. And so much is being produced in the process that they simply don't have the cognitive capacity to even retain it and understand where and what applies value to which end of the transformation. And that person feels that they have gotten a mantra from the governance that this needs to be done quickly. And so, to the listening tour, or to your point on the recognition over time that governance needed to change, right? That took patience, that took the openness to understanding the dynamics at play first before inserting something that may actually blow things up. So, how does a young leader find that balance?
I can imagine somebody, especially a first time CEO, wanting to make an impression. Like you hired somebody who's going to do some things, and I haven't had to deal with that. Right? I had a long time at AJ before I took this role. I guess is there a crisis, or is there just do you need to evolve the organization? I don't think there's anything magic. One of our jobs is to be clear communicators, what's going to happen, and people want to know how it's going to affect them, and you have to get clear on that. And that's not that takes some time because you need to know where that person is. So I do think it's taking conversations to understand where somebody is, what they're capable of absorbing, what they want to absorb. And I just don't think there's any quick way to get there unless you're in a crisis and you have to do something.
Mhm. So, Tom, this has been exactly the conversation that I hoped it would be. So, what strikes me listening to you is that through the lines of 3 decades, right, it isn't a strategy, is patience held in tension with your conviction and the willingness to do the invisible work for years and trust that it compounds. And you, again, you've been there for a long time. You were incredibly well respected in that area as well as in the association space for the leadership that you have brought to the table. So we measure leadership by the decisions that people announce. We rarely measure it by the groundwork that they laid a decade earlier that made those decisions possible. And you spent a career on the part that nobody claps for, and the institution itself is the evidence. So thank you for being so generous with what you've learned today.
Kevin, I'm flattered to have been asked, and all this stuff is born of painful lessons for the most part. My coaching, so for inviting me.
You're welcome. Thanks for being here, Tom. This season, we've been focused on the gap between what research predicts about organizational change and what actually happens in practice. And there may be no dimension of that gap less studied than time. What happens to transformation when it unfolds not over quarters and not even over a few years, but across decades? The willingness to do invisible work for years and the trust that it compounds. We measure leadership by the decisions people announce. We rarely measure it by the groundwork they laid a decade earlier that made those decisions possible. You've spent a career on the part nobody claps for, and the institution itself is the evidence. Thank you for being so generous with what you've learned. And to everyone listening, thank you for spending this time with us. Tom gave us something rare today, the long view, and a reminder that the most consequential work in any institution is usually the work that no one sees while it is happening. If today's conversation gave you a new way to think about the long arc of change in your own organization, here's how you can go deeper. The themes Tom and I explored: institutional memory, organizational ambidexterity, readiness, and the invisible groundwork that transformation across decades demands, run throughout my Transformation Psychology series at 2040digital.com. Explore the Human Factor Method and the Transformation Readiness Assessment, both available at transformationassessment.com. They measure not just whether people support change, but whether the organization is psychologically prepared for what real change actually demands. Subscribe to the Human Factor podcast wherever you watch or listen to podcasts. And please leave a rating and a comment. Share this episode with a leader who is playing their own long game and wondering whether the groundwork is worth it. Sometimes the most useful thing that you can give someone is the language for what they're already living. And if you want weekly insights on transformation psychology, organizational behavior, and the human factors that determine success, subscribe to my Ideas and Innovations newsletter at 2040digital.com or on Substack. Every Thursday, I share practical frameworks and research on why change succeeds or fails. Until next time, remember, the institutions that endure are not built by the decisions that we announce. They are built by the invisible work that we are willing to do for years before anyone applauds. This is the Human Factor Podcast. I'm Kevin Novak. Thanks for watching or listening.